Coming in at number 5, we've got niagva. It's debatable whether this fiend is an avatar of Nyarlathotep or not, but for the purpose of this video, we'll assume that niagva is a beast of its very own. Although being a part of Nyarlathotep would also earn you a spot on this list. Best described as inky black shadows, niagva is a great old one that often shows up in the Cthulhu mythos. Best known from its appearance in Henry Kuttner's The Salem Horror, it can strike fear deep into the heart of just about anyone. Some folks call it the thing that should not be, which is quite the moniker. Imagine being so horrid that your title describes a preferred state of existence where you just aren't real. Sheesh. Niagva can be summoned to the Earth's surface from secret caverns and fissures. Some say that it originates from Leng, while others have seen it in all sorts of places. Regardless, once summoned to Earth, it is very difficult to get rid of. The amorphous mass made up of an unnameable sticky black substance causes chaos and mayhem wherever it roams. Tentacles sprout from its body to interact with the world around it, choking and crushing all it comes across. After the accidental reincarnation of the witch Abigail Prynne, niagva was summoned to the surface. Luckily, an occultist was ready with the necessary tools to send it back. Only through the use of a ritual using an ankh, a special elixir, and an incantation can niagva be sent back to its dimension. So if you're not prepared with all three of those things, I'd say don't summon it. Although I'm sure some folks would love to see it run free.
Swinging in at number 4, the yellow sign. Tell me, have you seen the yellow sign? You see, we couldn't talk about the specific kind of eldritch dread culminated in the Yellow King without talking about his sigil, and also, you know, the first time we're informed of its existence. Damn. What's interesting is that in the opening short story, The Repairer of Reputations, we're informed of the yellow sign, a strange off-the-cuff reference of its existence uttered by the eventually mad Hildred Castaigne, but it's not until several stories later that it's actually described to us, a curious symbol or a strange letter in gold, the sigil of the Yellow King himself. What's brilliant about the 4th story in this collection, though aptly titled The Yellow Sign, is the method that Chambers uses in leading us toward an all too familiar destination. You see, the tale begins with a particular quote from a poet that Chambers admired, the Canadian writer Bliss Carman. Let the red dawn surmise, that would go on to form a portion of the Yellow King play. Let the red dawn surmise what we shall do when this blue starlight dies and all is through. Now, whilst we've spoken about the way that the yellow sign and the King in Yellow have subsequently been passed from pillar to post throughout art and literature, the yellow sign begins with such a literary device. And not only that, but Chambers goes on to use that as the internal narrative of this short story, narrated by Mr. Scott, who is more than likely Jack Scott, a character that features in The Mask, which we'll get onto. As he begins, there are so many things which are impossible to explain. Why should certain chords and music make me think of the brown and golden tints of autumn foliage? Why should the mass of Saint Cecile send my thoughts wandering among caverns whose walls blaze with ragged masses of virgin silver? You see, as if by design, Chambers always intended for the King in Yellow to be a strange vessel for nostalgia. His sign is one that we've seen before, but we can't quite place it. After all, isn't that the point? Next up at number 3, In the Court of the Dragon, which is perhaps the most mysterious entries in the collection, and one that hinges itself on the more traditional aspects of horror fiction that we expect. In many ways, The Court of the Dragon sticks out like a sore thumb in the confines of the collection, but that's exactly how and why it becomes so impactful. You see, just as we think that we're onto some kind of inexplicably tied together narrative, we're thrown off course by the ambiguity of The Court of the Dragon. Unlike any other story in The King in Yellow, it follows an unnamed narrator, a man who one night visits the Church of St. Barnaby in repentance for something that he can't quite yet explain, mentally disturbed by his reading of the play The King in Yellow. As he stares in awe at the majesty of the church's architecture, he is suddenly encountered by a strange and primal fear, one that is foreign to him yet familiar, which he manages to explain away as an effect of being in the church under the influence of the divine. However, as he sits between the pews, he notices that the man playing the organ at the back of the pulpit, there's something off about him, something quite strange that again he can't quite place, and the inability to explain this bizarre phenomenon angers him. You see, the strangest part of In the Court of the Dragon is the familiarity it has to another direct inspiration for Chambers' work, the original prose of Ambrose Bierce in his 1886 short story An Inhabitant of Carcosa. In the narrative of that particular piece, a strange man from the unknown city of Carcosa is confronted with his own death, and yet much like the unnamed narrator of Chambers' work, he can't quite explain how or why he is experiencing what he is experiencing. Obviously, trying to do this without spoilers is a little bit of a challenge in itself, but the most brilliant part of both tales is that their destination is ultimately the same. Where that destination is, well, you'll have to find that one out for yourself. Coming in at number 2, the mask. The next flag post in the continued mystery, that is the King in Yellow, and perhaps one particular short story that leads the way in more ways than one. After all, what happens once the mask has slipped? You see, what is most important for us to note is that throughout the collection, the same fictional play is referenced through tiny fragments of prose and poetry. The yellow sign is the first clear example of that, one that lets us know that there's something a little off about this story. It's not quite right. In terms of framing, you have to remember that for a collection of short stories written in 1895, stringing them together within a meta thread of a narrative wasn't exactly the most common of literary tropes, particularly when it came to horror. The yellow sign ties all of these things together. It makes us feel odd, and in many ways it sums up exactly why the King in Yellow has maintained itself as such a prominent theme in cosmic horror. You see, the mask is the first introduction of the actual prosaic evidence of the King in Yellow play, one that forms at the opening of the story and then culminates in a particularly unnerving moment in the story's collection known as the unmasking. You see, the mask isn't terrifying in the conventional sense, it's just straight up weird. Reading it is weird, and it's a style of horror that sets itself apart from the rest. Told from the perspective of a painter named Alec, the story is told verbatim about a famed sculptor, Boris, even a man who has devised a means of transforming objects into marble. Alongside his lover Genevieve and his friends Alex and Jack, it is alleged that Boris discovered this intriguing technique through anomalous means as detailed somewhere in the King in Yellow play. Now, in many ways, this entry is perhaps one of the most violent of short stories in the collection, but yet the framing behind it turns our attention away from the macabre and toward the unknown measure of the cost of creation. Yeah, the mask is weird, but it's also brilliant. And finally, coming in at number 1 spot, the King in Yellow. Alright, we're kind of cheating here in the sense that this story isn't exactly a story in the truest sense of the word, but instead the strange, titular yet fictional play that is found in fragments throughout the collection of this short story. This is the scariest of them all, because as we peel back the pages, we know that ultimately somewhere all of the horrors found in this collection are a result of the sinister, eldritch work of literature. I mean, it kind of goes without saying, but the fact that a fictional play has managed to create so much dread throughout the history of horror literature kind of says something about the ultimate goal that Chambers had in mind. And that's given the fact that it's only ever mentioned a handful of times throughout all 10 stories. We're given a brief fragment of Act 1, Scene 2, we're given reverence to the mysterious Cassilda's song, as well as an even smaller reference of a quote in the bitter cry of Cassilda and the closing lines of Act 1. And that's it. That's all we're given, and yet still over nearly 130 years later, we're still disturbed by its fictional message. So what do we know about the play in question? Well, we know that although its author is never named, during the events of the Repairer of Reputations, the narrator Hildred Castaigne believes them to still be alive, alluding to the design of the King in Yellow himself and the ultimate meaning of what the play's purpose is here in this mortal world. You see, we're given enough pieces to paint some form of a picture. The play itself concerns the final days of a dynasty, fictional or otherwise, of a distant world. Whether the characters Camilla and Cassilda are part of that dynasty remains to be seen, but one day a stranger arrives in this distant world heralding something or someone, and then after a masked ball where the pallid mask slips, the King in Yellow arrives and disaster follows. You see, what's so incredible about this story is how many interpretations it has now faced from various other authors throughout the past century. The King in Yellow has been redefined and then redefined, poking holes into who or what it actually is. But one thing remains the same. Have you seen the yellow sign? There it is again. That name, the Yellow King, another sign. For the curious amongst you, that scene was from the seminal season 1 of HBO's series True Detective, which is, for lack of a better term, bloody brilliant. I know I hark on about the series quite a lot, but really, season 1 of True Detective is one of the finest pieces of television ever created. That is not an overstatement, really, it's that good. But you might be thinking, hold on a minute, Jack, what are you talking about? What does a modern day HBO series about Louisiana detectives have to do with the King in Yellow? You see, maybe it doesn't. But the point is, it poses a far more important question to be asked of us in this episode. Why do all of these writers seemingly feel compelled to illustrate the exact same entity? What is it about the Yellow King that has caused such a stir and sent so many ripples throughout the flat circle of time. And while it's an important point to note because this story has its fair share of twists and turns, that it's going to be hard not to lose your head. But don't worry, we'll carefully read the tracks of this mysterious entity and hopefully not alert him of our presence. And whilst perhaps his first titular appearance is a good place to start in Robert W. Chambers' 1895 collection of short stories aptly named The King in Yellow, we have to first scale things back a few years earlier to 1893 and a writer by the name of Ambrose Bierce. You see, whilst H.P. Lovecraft and Edgar Allan Poe undoubtedly set the scene with their incarnations of cosmic horror and weird fiction, it could be argued that the bizarre works and the even more bizarre life of Ambrose Bierce lay the permafrost for the ensuing sanguination of horror in literature to come. Born in 1842 to Marcus Aurelius Bierce and Laura Sherwood Bierce, the father of the family in question had quite the air for alliteration. You see, Ambrose was the 10th of 13 children, each of them given their names beginning with the letter A. Abigail, Amelia, Anne, Addison, Aurelius, Augustus, Almeda, Andrew, Albert, Arthur, Adelia, Aurelia, and of course Ambrose himself. You see, this mortal reminder of language would be a caveat in his writing career, and his financially poor but incredibly literary parents instilled in young Ambrose a deep-seated love for books and writing. But it was later on in his life that Ambrose would forge his armoury for horror fiction, and in turn lay the seeds for the King in Yellow to step into our world. You see, Ambrose Bierce drew the vast majority of his inspiration from his time as an infantryman in the American Civil War of 1861, but it was at the Battle of Shiloh of 1862 where the scene was truly set. A bloody battle and a terrifying experience in Bierce's life that would have a profound influence on his literary career and his later life as a war veteran. This theme was perhaps most perfectly captured in one of Bierce's most renowned short stories, An Inhabitant of Carcosa, a place which would become incredibly important to the King in Yellow, a story told as a weird tale first published in the San Francisco Newsletter of December 25th, 1886. It details a young soldier returned from the American Civil War who awakens in the ancient, far-forgotten city of Carcosa. But of course, though Bierce had a long and fruitful literary career, which ended with one of the most infamous disappearances in literary history, one which has never been solved, may I add, what we're concerned with is a later story written by Bierce, first published on January 24th, 1891 in Wave, a short story known as Haita the Shepherd, and the first ever written document of the name Hastur, the entity that forms the basis of the King in Yellow in both cosmic horror and the later Cthulhu mythos. As Bierce would pen in the heart of Haita, the illusions of youth had not been supplanted by those of age and experience. His thoughts were pure and pleasant, for his life was simple and his soul devoid of ambition. He rose with the sun and went forth to pray at the shrine of Hastur, the god of shepherds, who heard and was pleased. You see, in this version, Hastur is a benign god, a benevolent entity that shepherds his flock on a strange and forgotten world. It was a theme that would embody the writings of Ambrose Bierce, a convention of men having no sway over their own destinies, even in the presence of an all-powerful god. Sound familiar? It would be a welcome reception then when in 1895, Bierce's contemporary, a man named Robert William Chambers, would take up the mantle of Hastur as well as the ancient forgotten city of Carcosa and attribute them to a new, far more cosmic kind of form. Chambers himself was a remarkable enough figure, particularly in the age of eccentrics so familiar with the birth of weird fiction. Although not exactly a household name, Chambers was a remarkable author, and although he never earned the posthumous acclaim that his later weird fiction prodigies would gather, Chambers laid the groundwork for the Yellow King and his great old brethren. His most renowned literary works, of course, is 1895's The King in Yellow, a book of 10 short stories first published by F. Tennyson Neely, fictionally set within the confines of a mysterious play. The King in Yellow, the vague veiled story of Casilda, Camilla and the Stranger, a play that perhaps has no final act, a play that, as explained by Chambers, is cursed. Now, although not all of the 10 stories are built around the mysterious King in Yellow, the image of this entity casts a long otherworldly shadow over the book. Characters explain throughout The King in Yellow that they themselves had attempted to read the play. Some of them are forever warned away from its strange cosmic allure, others are driven completely mad by it. As explained by the character of Castaigne in the first short story of the series, The Repairer of Reputations, I remember after finishing the first act that it occurred to me that I had better stop. I started up and flung the book into the fireplace. The volume struck the barred grate and fell open on the hearth in the firelight. If I had not caught a glimpse of the opening words in the second act, I should never have finished it, but as I stooped to pick it up, my eyes became riveted to the open page, and with a cry of terror, or perhaps it was of joy so poignant that I suffered in every nerve, I snatched the thing out of the coals and crept shaking to my bedroom, where I read and reread it and wept and laughed and trembled with a horror which at times assails me yet. Now that certainly sounds familiar, the King in Yellow, but perhaps the best demonstration of the mysterious figure in question is with the fourth story of the series, The Yellow Sign. As the two protagonists of the tale detail, after having read the King in Yellow play in its entirety, night fell and the hours dragged on, but still we murmured to each other of the King and the pallid mask, and midnight sounded from the misty spires in the fog-wrapped city. We spoke of Hastur and of Casilda, while outside the fog rolled against the blank window, panes as the cloud waves roll and break on the shores of Harley. Again, sound familiar? Or better still, does that seem familiar? Perhaps the strange yellow silhouette in the corner of your vision is getting clearer, but for Howard Phillips Lovecraft, Chambers' story and the many names that came with it would be the substance that he would huff and scatter out the scented visions of his seminal works of cosmic horror. Lovecraft noted that he first read Chambers' collection in January of 1927, where he collected the many names and titles laid out before him. The Lake of Harley, the Yellow Sign, Hastur, names and places that would later become commonplace in the Cthulhu mythos. You see, perhaps the most important spark of a synapse was that Lovecraft borrowed Chambers' method of vaguely referring to supernatural events, entities and places, which he in turn borrowed from bierce, so on and so forth until the end of time. It's a flat circle. Effectively, all of these stories, Haida the Shepherd, an inhabitant of Carcosa, the King in Yellow, retroactively became another key component in the occult literature that formed the Cthulhu mythos. It was in Lovecraft's 1931 novella, The Whisperer in Darkness, where they were ultimately forged, where Lovecraft would link the yellow sign to that of Hastur, offering an illusion that Hastur was in fact an entity, a cosmic entity, a mystery of unfathomable scope, one that not even Lovecraft himself would attempt to fully form, and in turn pass it on to the future generations of weird fiction writers to try and comprehend, just like how it too had fallen into his lap. In 1938, a far more unlikely candidate would pick up the mantle, if only briefly, with Raymond Chandler's detective short story The King in Yellow, in which Philip Marlowe, or Steve Grace in earlier versions, finds a famous jazz trumpeter dead in his bed wearing yellow pajamas. As the detective finds the body, he mutters, "The King in Yellow. I read a book by that title once." Although only small and not connected to the Carcosa mythos in the slightest, you could argue that Raymond Chandler's use of the yellow sign perhaps exemplifies exactly what makes this incredibly unique literary anomaly so remarkably special. It's like a strange cosmic joke that has been muttered through the ages and no one yet has spilled the punchline. It also exemplifies why cosmic horror as a fictional vessel works so well. It's based upon pockets and deep-seated seams of hidden knowledge, unknowable mechanics that are left without explanation, sometimes for forever. An open-ended mystery, a yellow sign scrawled on the wall in a stray panel of a comic book series, a pallid mask in mise-en-scène hidden only to those that don't recognize it, the name of Carcosa on a map in the appendix of a graphic novel. Still to this day, Hastur and the yellow sign are the key components in the same transposed mystery that has crawled from page to page ever since Ambrose Bierce first penned reference to it in 1893. And that's where we arrive now. Well, in the last decade anyway, right back to our first clip, season 1 of True Detective, a work of fiction that seemingly would have no other reason to pick up the Yellow King than to further the mystery in itself. And now, I'm certainly not in the business for even trying to attempt to spoil the contents of that series, because really, it needs to be seen. And well, if you're in the business of deciphering the next step in the age-old cosmic mystery of the King in Yellow, then it's certainly the next place that you'll have to look. Or well, take my word for it, it's definitely a place to start at least. The real question is though, what will be the next sign? What will be the next meaning of the yellow sign scrawled on a strange door down a dusty alleyway? Or perhaps an oddly familiar name in a video game, or the strange decoded lines in the lyrics of a song? We human beings are curious creatures, and the King in Yellow certainly knows it. Well, there we have it, horror fans, our latest entry in this Lore Explored series, and believe me, I enjoyed this one in particular. Kicking off at number 5, the repairer of reputations. And what better way to begin this list than with, of course, the first entry in Chambers' titular short story collection, and the first ever glimpse that we catch of that mysterious and terrifying fictional play of the same name, The King in Yellow. In many ways, the repairer of reputations was so ahead of its time that by its own accord is perhaps one of the finest yet lesser known examples of speculative fiction ever seen in the late 19th century. Written in 1895 yet set in the year 1920 in downtown New York City, The Repairer of Reputations tells a tale of a young man named Hildred Castaigne, a wealthy and affable man about town whose personality drastically changes after suffering a head injury following a horse riding accident. Subsequently, Hildred is committed to an asylum for treatment of his alleged insanity by the vague and mysterious Dr. Archer. In the meantime though, in this brave new world of 1920, the United States has prospered to incredible economic heights. So much so that a new ruling class of the aristocratic elite flourish in their shuttered off sovereignty. Oh, and also, suicide has been completely legalized, made generally and readily accessible in what the story refers to as government lethal chambers, rapidly rolled out suicide booths across America's towns and cities. Yeah, Futurama were definitely fans of chambers. However, while still recovering from his accident, Hildred Castaigne comes into possession of a document known as The King in Yellow, a mysterious and universally censored play which deeply affects his mental state. Slowly and gradually, as The King in Yellow wraps its tendrils into Hildred's mind, what was once a bright member of the gentry eventually descends into an eccentric recluse who spends his days poring over old books, maps and forgotten scrolls, whispering about the King in Yellow and the equally mysterious Mr. Wilde, the repairer of reputations. Really, suspension of disbelief is the very nature of this short story, and all is not as it may seem. This one is certainly one of Chambers' finest stories.
Coming in at number 4, we've got Groth. There is absolutely no way that the moon from Majora's Mask wasn't in some way inspired by this Lovecraftian deity. I remember being scared silly by that constantly encroaching, horrid-faced lunar body as a kid, and honestly, I still sorta am now. Unavoidable destruction slowly making its way towards you, and there is nothing you can do to stop it. Well, actually in Zelda there was a way to stop it, but in real life, we're pooched. That is what makes Groth so terrifically terrifying. It's a living planetoid originally created by Ramsey Campbell. It sort of looks like a gigantic red-brown moon with a huge red eye smack dab in the middle. On the surface, it is composed of iron, ash, and gas, and beneath the crust there are vast seas churning, making up that eye. As it drifts through the universe, Groth will close its eye in order to avoid detection. All the while it sings a siren song known as the Music of Spheres. You know, because moons are spheres. This tune will awaken any sleeping great ones and outer gods that may be close enough to hear. And of course, the awakening of these beings often means massive destruction. This isn't the only way Groth can cause mayhem though. It also enjoys destroying entire planets itself. In fact, now that I think about it, Groth is a bit like a natural sentient Death Star. No exhaust ports either. One notable planetary destruction involved blasting the home of Baugzuka to smithereens, forcing the Bringer of Pestilence to move to Earth where it now resides. Like, come on man, we've got enough going on without deadly interplanetary scorpions taking up residence. And to make matters worse, we can't even spend our last moments in peace and harmony. As Groth gets closer to planets that it intends to destroy, they experience insane natural disasters. Earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, tidal waves, wicked storms, you name it. It doesn't seem like Groth tends to cut deals with humans either, so strike this one off your summoning bucket list. Coming in at number 3, we've got the Zothic Demon Trio. Lynn Carter penned a series of short stories based on the Cthulhu mythos, featuring 3 terrible deities, sons of Cthulhu. These terrible monsters inspired much in terms of cult worship and mystical artifacts, which led to a smorgasbord of human suffering. In the cycle, scholars head on expeditions to discover the artifacts related to these gods. Of course, many are driven mad just by their presence. Often these gods will enter people's dreams, not unlike their father. And they inspired madness encouraging bloodthirsty cults too. The apple does not fall far from the tree apparently. The youngest son is Zothamog. This cone-shaped, razor-fanged freak has gigantic starfish arms and a mane of tentacles. He lives at the bottom of the sea waiting to be set free. Next up is Yog-sothoth, the second son. It appears as a gigantic humanoid frog cyclops. Yog-sothoth is so large that its fingertips are often mistaken for mountainous heads. Some say that it can only be measured in miles. Imprisoned in an abyss, it is served by the Yugs and their lord Ub. The first and most fearsome son of Cthulhu is known as Ghatanothoa. Horrid in appearance and in power, this Gorgon-like being takes great pleasure in immobilizing people and leaving their minds intact. Their consciousness is trapped in an immobile shell forever, causing them to go mad. The cult worshipping him was once the most powerful on the continent, but has since fallen from grace thanks to intervention from some elder gods. All three power-hungry mini Cthulhus have been imprisoned for eons and are just waiting for their chance to break free and rule some worlds. Don't give them that opportunity. Coming in at number 2, we've got Hastur, the king in yellow, the unspeakable one, he who is not to be named. Originally described as the god of shepherds, Hastur has since taken many forms. Some know him as the feaster from afar, a black shriveled monster with razor-tipped tentacles. The feaster pierces people's skulls and sucks out their brains. Hastur was first mentioned in Robert W. Chambers' The King in Yellow. The collection of short stories centers around a fictional play sharing the same name as the collection's title. After a relatively benign first act, it will drive readers insane with an absolutely wicked Act 2. Lovecraft was so enamored with the idea of this king in yellow that he started to include elements in his own stories. Hastur takes many forms in Lovecraft's tales and can be interpreted as a person, place, object, or god. Everything seems to come back to the cult of Hastur and Carcosa. Have you seen the yellow sign? And finally at number 1, we've got Yog-sothoth. Now, if there is a Lovecraftian monster with a reputation for being summoned, it has to be Yog-sothoth, the all-seeing outer god. Progenitor of Cthulhu and Hastur, Yog-sothoth is often called upon to assist mortals in performing all manners of occult deeds and rituals. Two particularly famous instances are in the case of Charles Dexter Ward and the Dunwich Horror, both written by H.P. himself. In the case of Charles Dexter Ward, Yog-sothoth is mostly mentioned in passing. At some point, the main antagonist, Joseph Curwen, managed to summon Yog-sothoth to gain forbidden knowledge. Curwen, along with his other warlock and occultist buddies, used this knowledge for evil, although the extent of which is up for debate. A prime example of this would be using certain cosmic powers to bring people back to life through their essential salts, which he did later to himself in order to take over his great-great-great-grandson's life. In the Dunwich Horror, Yog-sothoth actually managed to create 2 half-human offspring during a visit to Earth. It seems that Grandpa Whately was greatly interested in the occult and managed to summon the All-Seer to Earth to mate with his daughter. This produced 2 terrifying beings, the titular Barn-Size Horror and Wilbur. The latter of the 2 was much more human, but not quite human enough to avoid being a total pariah. He aged quickly, reaching full maturity in about a decade, and was taught dark rituals by his grandfather. Other than being a gross nuisance, Wilbur didn't cause too much trouble. His brother, however, bore a striking resemblance to their father. In fact, once it was left alone following the deaths of Grandpa Whately and Wilbur, Yog Jr. broke free of the barn and went on a rampage through Dunwich. Only an experienced team of occult scholars from Miskatonic could put a stop to all this. Now, these are only a couple examples of what might happen if you summon Yog-sothoth, but you can be sure any knowledge or power it grants you will come at a grave cost. Weigh your options before making a deal or performing any rituals.